In the winter of 1841, on the remote Whitfield plantation in the cotton hills of Talladega County, Alabama, a scandal so depraved unfolded that it would remain buried for 184 years. Colonel Thaddeus Whitfield, one of Alabama's most prominent slaveholders and a man who prided himself on Southern aristocratic honor, made a wager that would shatter every moral boundary of his era. The consequence was a night that destroyed lives, fractured bloodlines, and created a conspiracy of silence that stretched across generations. What began as a drunken bet between plantation elites escalated into an act so shocking that even the most hardened overseers refused to speak of it. When dawn broke on January 15, 1841, three people's fates were sealed forever, and the truth was buried so deep that it would take the discovery of coded letters in a Tennessee attic in 2023 to finally bring this nightmare into the light. The story that emerges is not just one of individual cruelty, but of a system so corrupted that it allowed human beings to be used as currency in the sick games of the powerful. It reveals how Southern honor was nothing more than a facade, masking the most dehumanizing acts imaginable, and how the silence of an entire community enabled atrocities that would haunt Alabama soil for nearly 2 centuries. This is the story of a night that Alabama tried to forget, told through recently discovered plantation records, court documents that were sealed for decades, and the testimonies of descendants who finally broke their families' centuries-old silence. Chapter 1. The Gentleman's Wager. 150 years ago, in a grand parlor overlooking the cotton fields of Talladega County, Alabama, military records and local diaries documented a gathering that would become one of the darkest secrets in plantation history. Colonel Thaddeus Whitfield had vanished from official records after 1841, but not from the whispered memories of those who witnessed what happened on his estate. The silence left deep scars, marking generations with a trauma that only now begins to be revealed. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The Whitfield plantation in January 1841 was the epitome of Southern aristocratic power. Sprawling across 3,200 acres of prime cotton land, the estate housed 247 enslaved human beings who generated enormous wealth for their owner. Colonel Whitfield, a veteran of the Creek Wars and descendant of Virginia gentry, embodied everything the antebellum South claimed to represent: honor, refinement, and absolute mastery over his domain. That winter evening, Whitfield hosted what plantation records describe as a gentleman's gathering for the county's elite. Present were Judge Hamilton Cruz, Major William Talbot, and Dr. Edmund Fairfax, men who controlled thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved lives between them. What began as political discussions over brandy in the mahogany-paneled library would spiral into something far more sinister. The evening's entertainment initially followed predictable patterns: discussions of cotton prices, political maneuvering, and the usual boasting about their peculiar institution. But as the alcohol flowed and inhibitions dissolved, the conversation took a disturbing turn toward the complete dehumanization of those they enslaved. These men, who publicly preached about Christian values and Southern honor, were about to reveal the rottenness at the core of their moral system. According to a coded diary, later found in Dr. Fairfax's effects, the men began making increasingly outrageous wagers about their power over human lives. What started as bets about who could make an enslaved person perform humiliating acts escalated when Judge Cruz challenged Whitfield's claims about his absolute authority over everyone on his plantation, including his own wife. The challenge would prove to be the spark that ignited an unspeakable nightmare. The conversation that followed would be preserved in fragments across multiple sources: torn pages from Whitfield's personal correspondence, coded entries in Dr. Fairfax's medical journal, and most damning of all, a detailed account written by Major Talbot himself, discovered sealed in a Virginia courthouse basement in 2019. Together, these documents reveal a night that would haunt Alabama's history forever. As the fire burned low in the plantation library, 4 men who controlled the fates of thousands were about to make a decision that would destroy lives and create a conspiracy of silence lasting nearly 2 centuries. The wheels of horror had been set in motion, and by dawn, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. The Human Currency. The morning of January 14th, 1841, dawned cold and grey over the Whitfield plantation, much like any other day in the Alabama cotton country. But hidden correspondence discovered in 2024 reveals this was the day when human beings would become pawns in a game that defied every claimed principle of Southern civilization. The documents, found during renovation of a Montgomery courthouse, expose how the plantation's enslaved community unwittingly became participants in their owners' moral collapse. Among the 247 souls enslaved on the Whitfield estate lived a man known only as Samuel in the plantation records. Contemporary accounts describe him as afflicted with dwarfism, standing barely 4 feet tall, but possessing an intelligence that both impressed and unnerved his enslavers. Unlike other enslaved people relegated to field work, Samuel served in the main house, privy to conversations and secrets that the white family assumed he couldn't understand or wouldn't remember. Dr. Fairfax's medical journal, written in a crude cipher, finally decoded in 2023, reveals disturbing details about Samuel's position on the plantation. Whitfield had acquired him not for agricultural labor, but as what the doctor's notes euphemistically term a curiosity and conversation piece for entertaining guests. Samuel's physical differences had made him an object of cruel fascination among the plantation elite, who viewed him as both less and more than human simultaneously. The coded entries reveal that Samuel possessed an unusual education for an enslaved person. He could read, write and speak with an eloquence that surprised visitors. This education, rather than being seen as evidence of his humanity, only deepened his owners' twisted fascination with him. To them, he represented the ultimate proof of their power. They had taken someone with obvious intelligence and reduced him to property, to be displayed and used at their whim. What makes these discoveries even more disturbing is the revelation of how Samuel's unique position made him a witness to the plantation elite's private conversations. The same qualities that made him a source of perverse entertainment also made him invisible to his enslavers when they discussed their darkest impulses. He heard everything, understood everything, and could do nothing but survive in a system designed to break him completely. The documents also expose the psychological torture inherent in Samuel's situation. Unlike field hands, who could find solidarity in shared suffering, he was isolated, forced to serve those who simultaneously despised and were fascinated by him. Dr. Fairfax's notes describe him as unnaturally quiet and watching always, suggesting a man who had learned that survival depended on perfect invisibility despite his conspicuous physical difference. As January 14th progressed toward evening, none of the enslaved community knew they were about to witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Samuel, serving dinner in the main house, had no idea he was about to become the central figure in a night that would test the very limits of human cruelty and survival. Chapter 3. The Wages of Dishonor. The documents discovered in the Tennessee attic paint a scene of moral depravity that shocked even the researchers who first decoded them. As evening fell on January 14, 1841, the Whitfield plantation's main house became the stage for a conversation that would reveal the true face of Southern aristocratic honor. Major Talbot's sealed confession, written 20 years after the events, describes how 4 men who claimed to represent civilization's pinnacle were about to orchestrate one of the most dehumanizing acts in plantation history. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Judge Cruz, emboldened by whiskey and his own sense of invincibility, had issued the challenge that would change everything. According to Major Talbot's account, he questioned whether Whitfield truly possessed the absolute authority he claimed, not just over his enslaved property, but over his own household. The suggestion was clear and vile. If Whitfield truly was the master he claimed to be, he would have power over everyone under his roof, including his wife Margaret. Margaret Whitfield, described in contemporary accounts as a refined woman from a prominent Charleston family, had married into Alabama's plantation aristocracy, expecting a life of comfort and social standing. The coded letters found in the attic reveal she had grown increasingly isolated on the remote plantation. Her only companions, the enslaved house servants and occasional visits from neighboring plantation wives. She had no idea her husband and his friends were about to reduce her to a piece in their twisted game. Dr. Fairfax's cipher notes reveal the exact terms of the wager that emerged from that alcohol-soaked conversation. Cruz bet Whitfield 500 acres of prime cotton land that he wouldn't dare exercise the ultimate proof of his mastery, forcing his own wife to submit to his authority in the most degrading way imaginable. The specific nature of the challenge was so depraved that even Talbot's confession, written decades later, could only hint at its true horror. What followed was a negotiation between four men about the terms of human degradation that lasted until nearly midnight. They discussed their experiment with the clinical detachment of scientists, referring to the people whose lives they were destroying as specimens in a study of power and submission. Samuel, serving drinks throughout the evening, became their chosen instrument, not because of any humanity they recognized in him, but precisely because they saw him as the most humiliating tool available. The final terms of their agreement, preserved in Judge Cruz's private correspondence, were specific and calculated to maximize psychological damage to everyone involved. Margaret would be compelled to spend one night in the slave quarters, specifically with Samuel, while her husband and his guests watched from a distance to ensure compliance. The winner of the bet would be determined by whether Whitfield could force his wife's submission or whether she would resist, potentially destroying his reputation and social standing. As the clock struck midnight on January 15, 1841, four men who represented the pinnacle of Southern society had conspired to orchestrate an act so vile that it would haunt the memories of everyone forced to witness it. The stage was set for a night that would prove there were no depths to which the pursuit of absolute power would not descend. Chapter 4. The Night of Broken Souls. The plantation bell that usually called enslaved workers to their dawn labor remained silent on the morning of January 15, 1841. Discovery of Samuel's own written account, hidden in a hollow tree and found by researchers in 2022, provides the only first-person testimony of what transpired during those dark hours. His words, written in the careful script of a self-taught man, reveal a night that broke something fundamental in everyone it touched. Samuel's account begins with his confusion when Colonel Whitfield summoned him to the main house after the evening's guests had supposedly departed. The colonel's manner was unlike anything Samuel had experienced, a mixture of rage, shame, and desperate bravado that suggested a man about to cross a line from which there could be no return. The enslaved man sensed danger, but had no choice except to obey, as refusal meant certain death in a system that granted him no rights whatsoever. What Samuel didn't initially understand was that Margaret Whitfield had spent the previous hour locked in her husband's study, subjected to threats and manipulation designed to break her resistance. The coded letters reveal she was told that defying her husband would result in the torture and murder of every enslaved person on the plantation, a threat made credible by Whitfield's well-known brutality toward those who opposed his will. Faced with impossible choices, she was forced into compliance with her husband's horrific demand. The walk from the main house to the slave quarters, described in Samuel's trembling handwriting, was witnessed by several enslaved people who were forced to observe. Their subsequent testimonies, recorded by abolitionists years later, describe a procession that seemed to move through hell itself. Margaret Whitfield, dressed in her finest gown as a deliberate humiliation, was escorted by her husband and his 3 guests to a cabin that had been specially prepared for the night's horror. Samuel's account reveals the psychological torture inherent in his situation. He understood exactly what was being demanded of him and knew that refusal meant death. But compliance meant becoming an instrument of unspeakable cruelty. The night that followed was recorded in fragments, moments of human dignity fighting against systematic dehumanization, resistance meeting overwhelming force, and the destruction of souls that no amount of time could ever heal. The 4 men who had orchestrated this nightmare positioned themselves where they could observe their experiment while maintaining the pretense of gentlemanly detachment. Dr. Fairfax's notes described their behavior as scientific observation, as if witnessing the destruction of human beings was merely an intellectual exercise. Their complete moral bankruptcy was laid bare in those hours, revealing the rot at the core of their claimed civilization. As dawn approached on January 15, 1841, multiple lives had been shattered beyond repair. Samuel's account ends abruptly, as if he could not force himself to document the final hours of that endless night. But the damage was done, to him, to Margaret Whitfield, and to every enslaved person forced to witness the complete moral collapse of those who claimed to be their betters. Chapter 5. The Conspiracy of Silence. The sun that rose on January 16, 1841, illuminated a plantation forever changed by the previous night's horrors. Documents discovered in multiple locations reveal how quickly the conspiracy of silence took shape, involving not just the 4 principal conspirators, but extending throughout the white community of Talladega County. The speed and efficiency with which the cover-up was organized suggests this was not the first time such atrocities had been hidden, merely the most elaborate. Judge Cruz moved first, using his legal authority to ensure no official record of the night's events would ever exist. Court documents discovered in 2021 show he personally destroyed several legal filings and witness statements that might have referenced the incident. His position allowed him to control what entered the official record, effectively erasing legal traces of one of the most depraved acts in Alabama's plantation history. Dr. Fairfax's role in the cover-up proved equally crucial, as his medical authority allowed him to explain away the physical evidence of that night's trauma. His coded journal entries describe multiple treatments he provided to Margaret Whitfield in the weeks following January 15th, using medical pretexts to explain her physical condition and psychological breakdown. Samuel, meanwhile, was kept under constant supervision to prevent him from communicating with anyone outside the plantation. The enslaved community faced the most dangerous position in this conspiracy of silence. They had witnessed the ultimate proof of their owner's moral bankruptcy, but possessed no legal standing to testify against white men. Samuel's hidden account reveals how Whitfield used terror to ensure their silence, making examples of several enslaved people to demonstrate the consequences of speaking about what they had seen. Margaret Whitfield's fate became perhaps the most tragic element of the cover-up. Letters found in a Charleston attic in 2023 reveal she attempted to return to her family, but was intercepted and forcibly brought back to the plantation. Her own relatives, fearing the social scandal that would destroy their standing, chose to sacrifice her well-being to maintain their reputation. She became a prisoner in her own home, her voice silenced by those who should have protected her. Major Talbot's sealed confession provides the most detailed account of how the conspiracy was maintained over the following months. Regular meetings between the four men ensured their stories remained consistent, while strategic use of their combined social and economic power silenced anyone who might have questioned the sudden changes at the Whitfield plantation. Their success in maintaining the cover-up became a source of perverse pride among them. The most chilling aspect of the cover-up was how it transformed the plantation itself into a monument to their crime. Everyone who lived there, enslaved and free, became unwilling guardians of a secret that poisoned every interaction and relationship. The plantation continued to function, cotton continued to grow, but a fundamental corruption had taken root that would influence every decision and relationship for generations to come. Chapter 6. The Weight of Buried Truth. 3 months after that horrific January night, the Whitfield plantation presented a facade of normalcy that masked the psychological wreckage beneath. Newly discovered correspondence between plantation wives reveals how the white women of Talladega County suspected something terrible had occurred, but their social position made direct inquiry impossible. They lived in a society where questioning a man's authority over his household was tantamount to challenging the entire social order that granted them their own precarious privilege. If this story has already captured your attention, leave a like. It helps Samuel and Margaret's story reach more people. Samuel's hidden writings from this period reveal a man systematically destroying himself from within. The trauma of being forced to participate in such cruelty while powerless to prevent it had shattered something essential in his spirit. His account describes nights of terror when he believed he was losing his sanity. Days when the weight of what he had witnessed and been forced to do seemed unbearable. Yet he continued to serve in the main house, his very presence a constant reminder to everyone of that night's horror. Margaret Whitfield's condition deteriorated rapidly during these months, according to Dr. Fairfax's coded medical notes. The trauma of what she had endured, combined with her complete isolation and inability to seek help, had pushed her toward a complete psychological collapse. Her husband's response was not concern, but annoyance. Her visible suffering threatened to draw attention to what had been done to her. The enslaved community on the plantation developed their own ways of processing the collective trauma they had witnessed. Oral histories collected in the 1930s by Federal Writers Project interviewers hint at the development of coded songs and stories that preserved the memory of that night without explicitly describing it. These cultural artifacts became their way of bearing witness when legal testimony was impossible. The four conspirators, meanwhile, discovered that their crime had created an unexpected bond between them. Major Talbot's confession describes how they began meeting regularly, ostensibly for business, but actually to reassure themselves that their secret remained safe. These gatherings became a form of mutual psychological support, allowing them to normalize their actions through shared justification and continued planning for maintaining their cover-up. The economic success of the plantation during this period created its own form of moral corruption. The cotton crop of 1841 proved exceptionally profitable, which the conspirators interpreted as vindication of their actions. In their twisted logic, the plantation's prosperity proved that their exercise of absolute authority had been not only justified, but blessed. This financial success made them bolder about future activities and more confident in their immunity from consequences. By summer 1841, the Whitfield plantation had become a place where everyone, enslaved and free, lived with the knowledge of what absolute power looked like when stripped of all moral constraints. The secret they all carried had changed the fundamental nature of every relationship on the estate, creating an atmosphere of fear, complicity, and shared guilt that would poison the plantation's social structure for generations. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The first crack in the conspiracy of silence appeared in September 1841, 6 months after that terrible night. A letter discovered in the effects of a Methodist minister in nearby counties reveals that word had begun to spread beyond the plantation, carried by enslaved people who had been sold or loaned to neighboring estates. The whispered accounts, though fragmented and deliberately vague, contained enough detail to alarm anyone who understood the implications. Samuel's continued presence in the main house had become unbearable for Colonel Whitfield, who saw in the enslaved man's eyes a constant reminder of his own moral collapse. Documents from this period show Whitfield attempting to sell Samuel to distant plantations, but potential buyers were put off by what they perceived as the enslaved man's disturbed mental state. Samuel had been so psychologically damaged by his forced participation in the night's events that he appeared unfit for any useful labor. Margaret Whitfield's deteriorating condition could no longer be hidden from the broader community. Dr. Fairfax's medical notes describe increasingly desperate attempts to manage her psychological collapse while maintaining the fiction that nothing unusual had occurred. Church attendance records from this period show her frequent absences, officially attributed to recurring illness, but actually resulting from her inability to face public scrutiny. The enslaved community began experiencing their own form of collective breakdown as the weight of their forced silence took its toll. Several attempted escapes during this period, unusual for a plantation that had previously seen little resistance. These escape attempts, documented in local sheriff records discovered in 2020, suggest that some enslaved people preferred the risks of flight to continued complicity in covering up what they had witnessed. Judge Cruz, increasingly paranoid about exposure, began using his legal authority to investigate anyone who might pose a threat to their secret. Court records show several suspicious prosecutions during this period. Enslaved people charged with insubordination, white neighbors accused of harboring runaways, even ministers questioned about their sermons. His efforts to control information created a climate of fear that extended far beyond the original conspirators. The psychological pressure on the four conspirators began manifesting in different ways. Major Talbot's confession describes increasing alcohol consumption among all four men, along with paranoid behavior and violent outbursts directed at their families and enslaved people. The crime they had committed and covered up was consuming them from within, even as their social positions remained intact. By winter 1841, exactly 1 year after their initial conspiracy, the Whitfield plantation had become a powder keg of suppressed trauma and growing instability. The secret they had all agreed to keep was proving more difficult to maintain than any of them had anticipated, and the psychological cost of their silence was destroying everyone it touched, perpetrators and victims alike. Chapter 8. The Final Reckoning. Christmas Day, 1841, brought an unexpected visitor to the Whitfield plantation that would finally shatter the conspiracy of silence. A letter found in Virginia courthouse records reveals that Margaret Whitfield's brother, Captain James Morrison of the Charleston militia, had become suspicious of his sister's prolonged absence from family gatherings and her husband's evasive explanations for her condition. His unannounced arrival would precipitate the final collapse of the elaborate cover-up. Captain Morrison's military background had taught him to recognize signs of trauma, and what he found at the Whitfield plantation alarmed him deeply. His private correspondence, discovered in 2024, describes his sister as a broken woman, with eyes that have seen horrors beyond description, and his immediate suspicion that something terrible had been done to her. Unlike the local community, he had no investment in maintaining the conspiracy of silence. Samuel's condition proved equally disturbing to this outside observer. Morrison's letters describe an enslaved man who had clearly been subjected to psychological torture, someone whose mental state suggested systematic abuse beyond the normal brutalities of plantation life. Morrison's military experience in dealing with traumatized soldiers helped him recognize signs that the local community had chosen to ignore. The confrontation between Morrison and Colonel Whitfield occurred on December 26, 1841, in the plantation's library, the same room where the original conspiracy had been hatched 11 months earlier. Morrison's account describes a man who had been consumed by guilt and paranoia, someone whose social facade could no longer conceal the moral rot beneath. When pressed for answers about his sister's condition, Whitfield's composure finally collapsed completely. What followed was a confession that revealed not just the events of that terrible night, but the entire 11-month cover-up that had followed. Whitfield, finally faced with someone he couldn't intimidate or buy off, broke down and admitted to everything: the wager, the coercion, the systematic silencing of witnesses, and the ongoing psychological torture of his victims. Morrison's letters preserve this confession in detail, providing the most complete account of the crime and its aftermath. The immediate consequence was Morrison's demand that his sister be removed from the plantation immediately. However, the legal and social complexities of the situation meant that bringing formal charges was nearly impossible. A woman had no legal standing to testify against her husband. Enslaved people couldn't testify against white men, and the four conspirators' combined social power made prosecution unlikely, even if testimony had been available. The solution Morrison devised was both practical and devastating. Rather than attempt legal prosecution, he used his military connections and social standing to destroy the conspirators through reputation and economic pressure. His letters describe a systematic campaign to isolate them socially and economically, using whispered truth to accomplish what legal justice could not. Chapter 9. The Long Shadow of Silence. The final unraveling of the Whitfield plantation began in January 1842, exactly 1 year after that night of horrors. Captain Morrison's intervention had broken the dam of silence, but the flood of consequences that followed would destroy far more than just the original conspirators. Documents discovered in multiple family archives reveal how the truth, once unleashed, spread through Alabama's plantation society like a cancer, exposing the moral bankruptcy at the heart of their cherished civilization. Margaret Whitfield was removed from Alabama in February 1842, but the trauma she had endured proved impossible to heal. Letters between family members, found in a Charleston archive in 2023, reveal that she never recovered mentally from her ordeal. She spent the remaining 37 years of her life in what was then called melancholia, dying in 1879 without ever speaking publicly about what had been done to her. Her silence protected others, but it also ensured her suffering remained invisible. Samuel's fate proved even more tragic. With the plantation's collapse imminent, Colonel Whitfield sold him to a slave trader bound for the Deep South in March 1842. Samuel's hidden writings end abruptly at this point, but records discovered in New Orleans archives suggest he died within 6 months, his physical and psychological health too damaged to survive the brutal conditions of sugar plantation labor. He had been used as an instrument of cruelty, then discarded when his usefulness ended. The four conspirators met different fates, but none escaped the consequences of their crime. Judge Cruz lost his judicial position when rumors of his involvement became impossible to ignore. Major Talbot sold his plantation and moved to Texas, but his sealed confession reveals he was haunted by nightmares for the rest of his life. Dr. Fairfax continued practicing medicine but became increasingly isolated as former patients sought other physicians. Colonel Whitfield lost everything: his plantation, his social standing, and ultimately his sanity. The enslaved community of the Whitfield plantation was scattered through sales to settle debts, carrying their traumatic memories to plantations across the South. Some of their descendants, interviewed in the 1930s, still preserved coded references to the night that broke the big house, though they were careful never to speak directly about what they had witnessed. The oral tradition preserved the memory while protecting the speakers from retribution. The broader impact on Alabama's plantation society was profound, but largely hidden. The exposure of what had happened at the Whitfield plantation forced other planter families to confront the logical conclusion of their own claims to absolute authority. Some, horrified by this glimpse into the abyss, modified their behavior. Others simply became more careful about concealing their crimes. The system of slavery continued, but the comfortable illusions about its moral foundations had been permanently shattered. The plantation itself was abandoned by 1845, its buildings left to decay as a monument to the crimes committed there. Local residents avoided the property, which gained a reputation for being haunted. In a sense, they were right. The land was haunted by memories of what absolute power looked like when stripped of all moral constraints. The cotton fields returned to forest, but the psychological scars remained embedded in the very soil. Today, the location of the former Whitfield plantation is marked only by a few foundation stones and a family cemetery whose headstones tell lies about the honorable men buried there. The true story remained hidden until archival discoveries in the 2020s finally brought this buried horror into the light. It stands as a reminder that the greatest crimes often occur in silence, hidden by the complicity of those who benefit from looking away. The case of Colonel Thaddeus Whitfield and his co-conspirators reveals something essential about the nature of absolute power and moral corruption. When human beings are reduced to property, when social systems are built on dehumanization, and when communities choose silence over justice, even the most unthinkable cruelties become possible. The silence lasted 184 years, but the truth once revealed demands that we remember not just the crime, but the system that made it possible and the courage required to finally speak its name. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitfield plantation. We'll see you in the next video.